Thursday of the month, but so tonight I'd like to welcome Dr. Martha Groom, who is a professor of biodiversity, conservation, and environmental studies at the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell, and the College of the Environment at the University of Washington. Her research spanned efforts to understand factors that influence species extinction and means to sustainably produce coffee. But her career for the most of the last 2 decades has focused on undergraduate education. She is the lead author and editor of the textbook Principles of Conservation Biology and is a co-founder and lead of the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program, which is a training program in conservation and environmental justice for students from racial and economic backgrounds too often excluded in leadership positions. In relation to her talk today, she is the lead author of Biofuels and Biodiversity, Principles for Creating Better Policies for Biofuel Production, and is currently writing an open source instructor's guide to teaching about energy justice. As a college educator, she's engaged with young adults seeking to help them build skills to confront the climate crisis. So I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Martha Groom. And as you see on the screen, she's going to speak to us tonight about how to respond to the Code Red for Humanity on climate. Martha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate the invitation to join you all tonight. And certainly this is an issue of enormous impact and import for us all. So I really look forward to presenting some ideas that I have and also hearing more ideas from all of you. Let's see, there we go. I just wanted to start by letting you know where I am. I'm in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle. That is, I'm on the traditional lands of Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Stillaguamish tribes, as well as shared waters and lands of and other bands that would come and still do come and use these areas. These lands are unceded, and I'm a guest on these lands. I also want to express a lot of gratitude to the present day members of these tribes throughout our area, because I think everything would be a lot worse if they hadn't done as much advocacy as they do and much resistance as they do to the expansion of fossil fuel projects in our region. So everybody here knows that human influence has warmed the climate and that we can't explain the changes that we're seeing by anything other than understanding what humans have done and how we have interacted with our climate system. And the IPCC released its most recent report on the physical basis of climate change, to which the Secretary General of the UN responded by calling it a code red for humanity, stressing the irrefutable evidence of human influence. The Guardian in October put it even more harshly. The climate disaster is here. Earth is already becoming unlivable. So the question is, will governments act to stop this disaster from getting worse? And I expand that question. How do we want to act to stop this disaster from getting worse? We've had evidence of just that reality, that it is here just this week. So we all experienced a really extreme rain event. And in areas to our north, this was really devastating. And in particular, our neighbors in Vancouver, for example, are cut off largely. And really, this is a mix of multiple aspects of our climate crisis hitting them at the same time. So the same rise in temperature that allowed extreme heat and wildfire in summer is allowed this movement of water vapor, allowing much more water vapor to come and make these atmospheric rivers that dump so much rainfall in such a short period of time. We see these kinds of events all over the world, but we saw it just a few days ago. From the Guardian article, which I highly recommend as an article that has done a particularly good job of translating the very dry report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, into something that we can really relate to. They have this depiction of when we can expect to see changes in temperature, depending on what we collectively do. So the best case is in blue, an intermediate case in orange, and red is the worst case scenario. Up until the last 4 or 5 years before the Paris Agreement, we were very much on the worst case scenario pathway. And largely because of the Paris Agreement and because of responses that have happened, that might not be the likely pathway anymore. However, we may not yet be on our best case pathway. So if you look at the graph, one of the things that really does stand out, probably makes you, take a deep breath, is that we will hit the 1.5 degrees average warming in 6 to 11 years. It will probably be before 9 years. We will hit it for short periods of time. We already have, but for that to be the average for the entire year. Moving to 2.0, that is if we hit our best case, that is if we do pull out all the stops, we won't hit that by 2080. We should avert that. We should not get all the way up to 2. But what's much more likely is that in about 30 years, we will hit 2 degrees of warming. And if we don't behave well and act soon, in that same roughly 30 years, it might actually be 2.5. 3 degrees of warming is absolutely horrific. And that could happen as early as 43 years if we follow the worst case scenario. So what does that mean for what we can do? Following the Paris Agreement, which initially was talking about trying to keep to under 2, the question was, but that would be far too bad for too much of the world. So how can we actually get it to 1.5? They commissioned the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees of warming. And in that report, they said, well, we've gotten to about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming, already emitted 2,400 billion tons of CO2 equivalents, and have about 500 billion tons before we would get to about really a coin flip, a 50-50 chance of staying under 1.5, and that we were emitting about 40 billion tons a year. Now, in the few years since that report came out, with the report that came out this August that I just spoke about, we actually only have 400 billion tons left. So again, that's where we get about 10 years under a good scenario. And that only gets us to the 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5. So into this comes, the climate conference, the conference of the parties, signatories to our global climate agreement. And in particular, this was a meeting to really address what were the commitments individuals, nations were making under the Paris Agreement and strengthened clauses of the Paris Agreement. And, there's a lot that we probably sort of expect from that, but I wanted to just take a minute to explain how these commitments work. So if we're aiming to get to sort of a net zero of emissions, and in this graph, it's hitting it around 2067, you have total greenhouse gas emissions, gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents on this axis. This is where we are, and we could keep on going, curving very late or curving a bit sooner downward, and then trying to rush to that point. Or we could kind of go steadily down to that point, or we could take really drastic action now and do an accelerated path. The amount of extra carbon emitted in these different scenarios is substantial. And that's what differentiates those different pathways that we might see us going down that I showed you in the Guardian graphic. Now, this is from the International Energy Agency's emissions gap report. They looked at what the actual commitments that have been submitted to date are for a number of the G20 nations. And you'll note that a number of them are pursuing that delayed action pathway. And then there are maybe not as far above, but still above that pathway. And only the United Kingdom has a very shallowly accelerated timetable among the major emitting nations and major global economies. But it's been interesting. The conference did have the effort or had the impact of accelerating some of the pledges or increasing them. So this is there are several analyses already that have come out of what the new commitments could do in terms of total warming. And this is just a clearer one than most put out by the Climate Action Tracker. So we're now at 1.1 to 1.2. Here's our goal, and here we are getting into terrible territory. And what's on the ground today is probably moving towards about 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. And if we had full implementation of the targets for what they'll do in the near term by 2030, that gets us down a little bit because there hasn't been that much anteing on a very rapid timescale. Adding new submitted pledges, it comes down a little bit more. And then mostly through the actions of India in strengthening its target, actually having a target at all, which it didn't really before. This gets us into, for the first time, an optimistic scenario that might even get us close to 1.5, but would probably get us to about 1.8. And this is all with these nice little asterisks that say a number of things. One, some targets actually proposed were weaker than the original targets. So, or really were nothing at all. So a number of them really didn't move and help us. But it all depends upon countries actually fulfilling their promises and meeting their targets. So this is just to show that we actually made a lot of progress through this conference. The COP26 led from going from a set of commitments that the other graph said 2.7, but maybe 2.6, to right before the conference, 2.4, and then afterwards, and another 0.1 degree off. And then if you add their net zero promises by 2050, you come down still further. And so that really, that is an impact. That's more of an impact than we've seen in most of these conferences. So there does appear to be an acceleration of action. So what came out? We saw some accelerated commitment in the targets. They did complete the Paris rules, so on how the progress would be made, how accounting would be done, and they also increased wealthy country financing poorer countries for their climate mitigation. And then this is the first agreement, number 26, that explicitly mentions reducing fossil fuels, which are of course the lion's share of climate emissions. So that's all good. Not as good is that if you look at this trajectory out to the end of the century, or even out to 2050, or especially early on, there's still a very large gap. Most of the countries are not pledging to act terribly quickly. And in addition, their goals that would take them down involve a lot of carbon capture and sequestration, which at this time is is both quite expensive and not nearly as effective as is necessary. So they're counting on a lot of R&D and success in those ventures. And it does also mean that all of these policies have to get enacted and enforced. We still have a gap. So we have a gap in climate ambition that we need to somehow close. And I want to just take a minute to talk about why it matters so very, very much. The UW Climate Impacts Group did a nice job taking the special report 15 from IPCC and explaining what the differences were between a 1.5 degree average warming world to a 2 degree of average warming. And the impacts are really bad, but the impacts are much worse if we get to 2, and then again, much worse if we go beyond them. So the exposure to heat waves will be about half the world is going to be regularly exposed to extreme heat waves, but it would be 2/3, be 6 billion if we went all the way to 2. We would have decline in harvests and fisheries that would be made 1.5 or 1/3 times worse. We will be losing species that could be as much as 2 times worse with just that 0.5 of the warming more. Water scarcity would worsen, and then the costs would worsen. I think it's useful to think about how big these costs are. Annually, it will cost 54 trillion to address the impacts of global warming. At just a 1.5, it'll be at 15 trillion more at 2 degrees of warming. So every 1/10 of the degree actually matters. We shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't give up. We should be feeling really motivated to do all we can to get this down as low as we possibly can. So in terms of what wasn't achieved and where we need to keep going, the biggest emitters need to have much higher commitments. Their targets are too low. That includes us. We also need greater transparency, more clarity about what nations actually are doing, what their emissions actually are. And we also need much more financing, and particularly financing from the wealthy to the poorer nations. We also need a commitment, an actual commitment to swiftly reducing fossil fuels. Much has been made of the switch from watering down our coal commitment, but it is still the first time a commitment to reducing coal has been in there. There is no word whatsoever about reducing oil or natural gas. So we need this for all 3 of our major fossil fuels. So I know that you all know a lot of that, and I go over it though to emphasize both how much action actually is happening on the world stage, and that each of those 1/10 of degree of warming that we might be able to avert matters. And hopefully to have everyone ready and primed to say, yes, we need to help, we need to respond, we need to promote a fast transition that I've convinced you that it needs to be as fast as possible, but it also has to be a just transition. The climate change is an extremely unjust phenomenon. It is impacting those who have contributed the least to it the most, and we need to attend to those impacts. So we need to stop baking in, pun intended, future fossil fuel emissions. So we really need to halt new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to reduce our current emissions. We need to expand clean energy infrastructure. And for all of that, it's necessary to have government and corporate leadership. So it is necessary for us to either in any positions that we may hold in those areas, those domains, or use all of the levers we can find to influence those domains. We also really need to advocate for and personally attend to ways in which the benefits of a transition could be equitably experienced, to really engage with and uplift community efforts from those on the front lines. So two general themes for how we need to help. One is changing the narrative. How do we talk about this and talking with everybody about this? And the other is really helping to change the incentives. So this is somewhat how I'll go through thinking about all of this. And just before I leave this section, I want to just emphasize that, I very much view this as a moral imperative. Our response is a moral one. We owe a lot to the youth of our world. We also especially owe support to Black and Indigenous and persons of color who have been disproportionately impacted, who live with a wide range of injustices and are especially impacted at these times. And young people are looking to us, their elders, and they experience a lot of anxiety. They feel utterly, utterly betrayed. And they feel injured. And this is a global phenomenon, but you see it, and I see it all the time among my students. And they feel betrayed by us, their elders, for not necessarily showing that we're with them and making it obvious that we're acting, making it obvious that we're listening. So I'll come back to those things. Okay, changing the narrative. What are some of the things that we can do? One of the things that's totally awesome is that there's just so much we can do. Many of you may know about Project Drawdown. And if you do not, I recommend visiting their website. It is a really inspiring compilation of means that we can use that exist now. So the Drawdown framework has thinks about all the ways in which we have inputs into the atmosphere from our electricity production, the ways in which we use land and grow food and eat food, our industry, transportation, buildings, lots of other energy related emissions. And then we've got natural sinks, the ocean, the coasts are land sinks, and about almost 60% remains in the atmosphere. So we need to reduce the sources, bringing emissions to zero. We need to support nature sinks and expand them. And we need to improve society. One of the most beautiful parts of Drawdown is that their analysis of especially empowering young women and women in general, investments in women and girls, and improving equity across the globe is one of the most impactful ways we could address our climate crisis. So they explored 32 existing options, and they calculated the emissions reduction impact, implementation costs, and long-run savings. And they looked at it for each of those different kinds of sectors and looked at existing options within those sectors. And they came out with these bottom lines that if we electrify our lightweight cars, that would avert somewhere between about 12 and 15.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent between 2020 and 2050. That it would have an upfront cost of $4.67 to $6 trillion, but it would actually save us an awful lot of money over the long term. This is one of the ones that, and virtually all of their existing options save money over time, sometimes really substantially. So here is some more data from the Drawdown project. In terms of reducing sources, we could, if we are shifting production from fossil fuel to clean energy, that does the most. Enhancing efficiency also is quite impactful. In terms of food, agricultural land use, I won't talk about that much, but if we address food waste and eat a more plant-based diet, that also is enormously impactful. Addressing refrigerants and ensuring that the disposal does not add to fluorine gases in the atmosphere is a very big one as well. So if you take all of these, you can look at it more in a bar graph form. Addressing electricity has the biggest impact, how we generate that electricity. but also the ways in which we are electrifying and doing heavy industry, how we address transport and how we address buildings, all of those reductions for sources are going to have a fairly large impact. We can also enhance sinks and, as I said, improve people's health and education. If we look just at energy, which is the focus for today, wind and solar are everything. So most of what you see in terms of there's sort of two levels of here of kind of one level of production and then really being a bit more aggressive about it. So that's the two parts of these circles. But even taking these large minimum levels, we really see very big things from onshore wind is the largest, and then utility scale solar or distributed solar, and then offshore wind and concentrated solar somewhat less. Future technology improvements may increase the roles for geothermal, ocean power, et cetera. So we may see those coming up. But when we think about that, what are we going to do by 2030 question, we're looking at wind and solar. So how do we help that move forward? I really love this blog that I saw in early September by Kinsman Bond and Sam Butler-Sloss. And they put it as this was kind of what they ought to do in the COP26 meetings. Talk about the gain, not the pain. That we have had this very, very, very long narrative that has all kinds of danger and problem, and especially because of cost around solar and wind, as well as other renewable energy, and that we actually really need to talk about the gains. And I would say now that meeting is passed, all the more so, because what has to happen is those commitments need to be kept and expanded. We need to come back year after year. The nations must come together and continue to up their commitment. And that's only going to be happening if they change and are moved by their people. And that is going to be because they're motivated by the gains. Focusing on the pain doesn't make it. So we changed the narrative on supply. And for a long time, the narrative was, well, we don't have that much because solar isn't as efficient and yada, yada. But actually, we have incredible technical potential right now. So our annual electricity consumption is depicted here, and we could more than meet that with offshore wind. And then utility scale photovoltaics is through the roof. When we look at this, we also have to kind of address how the naysayers come to this, all right, so that's our electricity generation, but how do we deal with oil? How do we meet our liquid fuel needs? We can't do this with everything. And then, of course, the answer on that one is electric vehicles. And interestingly, we've seen some really interesting advances. One I saw today, which came out in Nature Energy, showing that that freight trains could be retrofitted with electric engines that can go for about 240 kilometers, and it immensely reduces costs, and the health impacts are absolutely enormous. So we have a lot that's right with us now, and we are really accelerating on getting heavy vehicles to be electrified. So this is really exciting. Again, we're going to need support to do it. The other naysay is, won't this really be hard to fly planes and power ships from these sources? And the answer is, yep, yes, it would. And that's not going to change in the next 10 years, a lot. But we don't have to change everything at once. We have to take inroads now, but we don't have to do it all in these next years. And future developments are likely to especially support green hydrogen or algal biofuels. So a liquid replacement, there may be additional ways that battery powers could be used. Probably some kind of fuel source will be necessary. Other things to think about on the narrative supply, that was just looking at the US, but if we look globally, it really is an incredible opportunity. The resource potential for wind and solar vastly exceeds energy demand almost in all of the world, particularly on the African continent. And generally, countries that have had less demand on energy have a really super abundance of resources. But even countries that have very high energy demand often have very abundant resources. And there are no countries that would be unable to meet their energy demands by deploying solar and wind. So we're really, we have so much. We just have to cite it very carefully. Where do we put our these facilities? Has to be a carefully considered effort. And the good news there is that there's been a lot of research on that as well. I'm not going to present on that, but I will say that there already is a lot of consideration going into where to place these facilities. Another place that we might change the narrative is on trade-offs. Both wind and solar could be integrated with agriculture. I did a sabbatical in Denmark, and the integration of wind and agriculture is everywhere, and it's quite easy. This is a photo from an experimental farm that found that not only was it not incompatible, actually the solar panels provided enough shade for the crops that it reduced water demand enormously, and it still produced as much produce as it would have if it had not had the solar panels present, and then the power generated enough power for 300 homes. So that's not a promising thing, that even something that we think, oh, we can't possibly combine solar and agriculture. Well, maybe we can, not everywhere certainly, but maybe we can in many places. And maybe it actually could help us with our challenges of increased drought stress in so many areas that we depend on for growing food in this country and elsewhere. Another way to think about this, and maybe flipping the narrative of gain, not pain, renewables are so much cheaper. This is a figure that comes from Bloomberg, kind of think tank arm on energy, and it shows the reductions in price, and in the lines, and then the gray shaded areas, there's the increased installation of solar photovoltaics, onshore wind, and batteries. And they state in their analyses that they see that replacement of coal by renewables in the near term as absolutely inevitable now, just due to market forces, and that the only thing that would stop it would be an intervention in the market forces to skew it towards coal and away from renewables. So that is interesting, and it's significant when major financial advice is speaking in those terms. Another one is thinking about it in terms of a return on investment. So one measure of the value of an investment is the return on the investment. How much do you get back for each dollar you invest? And the energy return on investment has been dropping for coal and oil for some time. So it's been moving along a line where it gets to a point where it goes over what they call an energy cliff. It just becomes, the return is too close to zero to be worth investing. And so then you're just not producing any more energy. So it goes down to zero. And oil and coal have been actually sliding down closer here. Depends a bit on the exact one. Natural gas is back up in here. If you look at what's happening for renewable energy, depending on the type and the location, is somewhere along the span in here. That is, it's already sitting at a more favorable return on investment than most oil and coal. Similarly, if you look at how much capital return, what kind of return you have to promise to get a loan now to invest in creating a new, digging a new well, pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. Offshore oil, you have to have about 20% return. Liquid natural gas, that's 10. whereas the renewables are down here in the 3 to 5% range. So right now, in terms of where ought you invest, you actually ought to be investing in renewable energy. And in fact, you're seeing major investment firms making these pivots right now. Another one is on, this is a job generator. That's been a big point of discussion. And it's been very much cast that renewables are a job killer. And actually it's the reverse. There are many more jobs available in the green economy than in the fossil fuel industry. As an example of that, this is from the Energy Policy Simulator, and I'll present something on that in a minute. You'll get 5 million jobs being generated through this switch, where you have most of it coming from manufacturing, construction, setting up these facilities, and then a lot of jobs that are around maintaining and that just a lot of associated jobs with the clean energy economy. Fossil fuel jobs, and then also utility, which may not be fossil fuel related, will still have some role to play, but much lower. Another way to think about our flip is, where is the pain? The pain is with sticking with fossil fuels. And so I know you're aware of this, but I think it's sometimes helpful to be supported by good data. This is from the Global Climate Change Report for the US National Report that came out in 2018. And this is the drawn from Science article that looked at, and also from the IPCC reports. If you look at the different scenarios from then the earlier report, so sort of close to where we were heading, maybe not quite that pessimistic, but close, or a 2.1 scenario or 1.5 scenario, how much would that cost in gross domestic product, given that the temperature change that would follow on, that is, and all the different climate impacts that we just talked about a bit ago: floods, heat waves, hurricanes, etc., wildfire. And so if we went with the 1.5, it's a more modest increase, and it's a fairly small impact on our GDP. If we have it 2, it could range up to around 3 to 4, and then beyond that is really 10% it gets up to in the extremes. So those totals came from looking at a lot of different components of our economy and where the impacts would be felt. And this figure shows 2 impacts of changes in the number of hours people could work, the impact on labor due to extreme temperature change, particularly in summer, where you get a 5% decrease in parts of Texas and Florida, and broadly through the South and the Midwest, losing 3% of the working hours because it's just too hot to work, too extreme, or there have been weather disruptions of another nature. And that is costly. That's $60 billion difference between leaving it the way it was and aiming for that 2.1 level. If we continued and made improvements towards 1.5, we would see a similar decrease, maybe having it. So they also looked at this a lot of different other sectors, and in each case, labor was the largest, but the next one was temperature mortality, the loss of life in heat dome events is the next biggest cost to our societies, as well as impacts on coastal property through sea level rise. And so they total all this up, and it's a lot for each of these. So there could be a lot that we could get into and use from reports of this nature. A different way to also talk about gains and thinking about the goods is also thinking about how this could interact with our global goals. We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are meant to help lift people from poverty, to improve quality of life worldwide, and to improve our environment. All of the ways in which we could address our need to pivot around moving away from fossil fuel use, et cetera, would have an impact. And the drawdown group has analyzed this in great detail. They've looked at direct benefits and indirect benefits, as well as trade-offs, negative impacts on each of the individual goals. And they found that in all cases, there are so many different ways in which direct benefits would happen, and all the more so if you look at indirect benefits in each case from enacting these drawdown solutions. They also depicted this in a kind of complicated way. These are all their solutions for addressing energy, buildings, transportation, industry, agricultural, food systems, and land use. And the SDG 17, which is around the coordination among the world's nations, is necessary to do all this. So it links to everything. But then if we institute these, they're going to have impacts on all of these goals. And for many of them, they're really wide. There's a lot of different ways that these goals will be supported by making these kinds of changes. And we could get into those specifics and use those as ways to help people be really excited about individual solutions and implementing those, because they would have myriad synergistic supporting roles, and we might want to go that way. So there are a lot of ways that we could just put the rainbow on and really think about the gains and emphasize the gains. So how about changing incentives? To do this, we need to enact policies that will accelerate the transition. That is really that's partly why I started with COP26, and it should also be on all of our minds because our Congress is engaged in this right now. The most potential for near-term reductions is in really working at shutting down coal and addressing our energy sector, especially for electricity, but also for natural gas. And then industry and forestry are another areas where near-term we could do a fair bit, and then transportation, agriculture, buildings, etc. So the Energy Innovation Policy and Technology think tank has created a policy simulation. They call it the Energy Policy Simulator, and I can share the URL for this. It's a really interesting simulation to work with. It has taken major types of policies with lots of different kinds of possible settings and really taken a systems level view of how would that change emissions, as well as a number of other factors. And this is their output for taking the US's original commitment, so it doesn't have the improved commitment. So where we were in 2020 to getting to 2050. And if you look at all the different possible policies that are included in here, the ones that would have the biggest impact early, so before 2030, are early retirement of coal power plants. Turning Centralia off in 2024 instead of 2025, 2023, that'd be great. The subsidies for clean energy production are a necessity. Methane capture is very important, and that is one of the other positives that came out, was a commitment to really address methane. And more electrification of industry and buildings. By 2050, all of these are still important, but the clean energy standards, some kind of standard that is requiring utilities to increase how much of their power is gained through clean electricity, is hugely impactful. Electrification generally is, and if you can get hydrogen to work, it would make a big difference as well. And then helping support electric vehicle sales, making that through a standard that that fleets have to meet. These make very, very large differences. They also have different kinds of costs. This is a cost abatement curve. So this here, this shows how much it costs per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then the width of these different bars for the different policies is how much impact it has on emissions. So something really long has a bigger impact, and something really skinny. The ones that save the most money by 2030 are the subsidies for clean electricity production and the EV sales standards. So changing their standards for MPG and how much we sell. A number are basically cost neutral, and that's the methane capture and destruction, the clean energy electricity standards, and early retirement of coal power plants. And then, because largely of the difficulties of electrifying industry, heavy industry, and also trying to create hydrogen fuels, that's going to be more expensive, even though it could have a very large impact. So they've also looked, how does this translate into the current US proposals, the specific proposals in Build Back Better and infrastructure policies. And this was looked at in October of 2021 before the clean electricity power plan was basically eliminated, which is one of the sad things, because that was enormously impactful. But many of the things that are still in what the signed infrastructure bill, including addressing methane and various kinds of incentives and infrastructure investments, are still in there, and they, also add up to a very hefty impact. So there are still a lot of things that have already been agreed on and were not done. So these can have really big impacts, but it's also, to me, really revealing that that we can really look at what specific kinds of policies may have impacts, and then use that to guide our involvement in the political process. Energy policies also have enormous health impacts in the US. Air pollution from coal and oil extraction, transport, and burning are contributing to thousands of deaths every year. Worldwide, it's a horrific over 8 million deaths per year due to the burning of fossil fuels and extraction of fossil fuels. Just like in the other simulation results I showed you, those early actions, so early retirement of coal plants, and really putting as much as we can into clean electricity now, getting that infrastructure going now, has the biggest impact on health early. And then as you move farther, some of the other components gain. And in particular, it matters a lot how we're kind of moving building efficiencies forward. So there's lots of weeds we could get into there. Broadly, to get any of that stuff to happen, I think we really have to be thinking about all of the economic levers that are there. So how much money is being put in? In the pandemic, the US supported fossil fuels to the tune of $316 billion and supported renewables to the tune of $267 billion. Our government subsidies, that's about as good as even as we've been, it's still worked in the wrong way. So we need to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels and really ramp up the subsidies for renewables. The investment banks, the World Bank, have an enormous impact on whether new projects get built and how they're built. So that's an area that is an important lever. As is how private investment firms are making their decisions, where our retirement funds are being spent. Insurers have an enormous impact on what projects go forwards and which ones do not. Increasingly, we could see shareholders playing a larger role in trying to push corporate responsibility. And now one of the most exciting things I find is the election of shareholders who are not after just profit, but rather responsibility on Exxon's board, making the company start to make shifts that it may not have been able to make without that kind of active engagement. Increasing climate disclosures, which is a big discussion at the COP meetings, because that allows you to see where the actual exposure and risk are, because all of these assets are Bloomberg is already saying coal is on its way out, is inevitable. So what does it mean if you continue to invest, then you're making a really poor financial choice. And in all of this, how public opinion intersects with and pushes on all these different levers is really enormous. And so I think this is one of the places, all of these different places, wherever you can see yourself, are places where we can engage. Will there be political support for this change? Interestingly, the Pew Research Center came out with a poll that showed that regardless of political background, people want more solar and wind. There's tremendous public support for building solar power farms and for wind turbine farms. And then there's more mixed support for nuclear or offshore oil and gas, with less of the public in support, and even less for coal. And I think we can't talk about politics without getting into partisan gridlock. We are seeing it play out. We see the attention paid on Joe Manchin and his decisions, and not necessarily even really engaging with the fact that no Republican in the Senate is supporting climate action. It's kind of unthinkable. How did we get to these states, and what can we do now that we're here? And really, again, as a picture, we need to get proactive. These are, our youth are in the streets about this. So what do we do as their elders? We get more active nationally or locally. We're writing and making phone calls. Can you have a daily engagement? Can you at least have a weekly engagement? How do we make our views known and make our voices heard? Attending town halls can be especially effective. I've given you like a smattering of different ideas and different information, using some good information to craft a really succinct pitch of, this is why we need to do this. It's poor economic sense to keep going in this way. Know if that's what's going to move your legislator. What do they care about? What do they respond to? Can you craft it in relation to their issues? These are all strategies we can and should use. The other is really to lift up youth voices, to lift up frontline voices, listening and hearing what are their arguments, what are the concerns, how do they want to see things addressed, letting them be the ones to say it whenever possible. But the truth is that they are often ignored. So how is it that you can support them? You can amplify their voices. You can connect very explicitly to the stories that they have to tell. You can tell stories of your connection with our youth and your caring for what it is that why does it matter to you personally. Telling stories can be enormously effective in helping to move individuals. In all of these, I'm thinking about ways in which we engage through our active connection with others, and particularly others with power. The other is voting, of course, but not just voting, but explaining why to the candidates you are voting, explaining why in a letter to the editor you're going to vote in a particular way. Another lever that has been used, and I just want to touch on briefly, is changing incentives through litigation. There's been a lot of rights-based climate litigation, the rights of youth, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and they've been successful in some instances. The Hague Court ordered Shell to slash CO2 emissions. That's an enormous impact, although this week Shell is perhaps moving to the UK to avoid some of this, and they will challenge this in court. But there may be some new directions that come out of that. We have a youth case and have had for some time against the Juliana versus the US government. We have also had one against the Washington DOE. And these are cases that we can support. I'm going to just point out, you could have been in a talk by the Drawdown, Project Drawdown and All You Can Save group on what can be done at work. This was going on simultaneously to this talk. But you can also go to their website and download their information. They have a lot of ways that you can engage where you work or where you had worked as a retired person. It still matters to kind of push for specific things. There are many, many things we could do on a daily basis in our work lives that would help our work, where we work, change. I've been really pleased to be able to be on a campus that is as active in trying to reduce its impacts and become a more sustainable space throughout my time there. It's been really, really enjoyable. So I'm going to close. I talked too long, but I want to close with this very beautiful and happy image of a student who I absolutely adore, and just how very much we have to look forward to. This world will still be beautiful, and our support and our connection to the individuals here is always going to matter. Every single thing we do is going to matter, and I want us all to do our utmost. So how should we respond? I'd like to know what you think. I'd love to hear your responses and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. This was an amazing talk, very, very eye-opening. And we do have a lot of good questions and comments. So I'll start with one that interests me a great deal too. So I'm glad that that it was brought up. Drawdown was the focus of the 2018 Thurston Climate Action Team Climate Convention locally here. And this participant said that his favorite session combined demographic research with a presentation by Dining for Women on the value of empowering girls and women in mitigating the climate crisis. Now, this was more of a comment to share, but I'm curious if you can speak to that a bit more. Why is empowering and educating girls and women so important to this cause?
Yeah, it's tremendously important. They've shifted a little in their analysis. It's not as large an effect as they thought, but it's still huge. It comes from two sources. One is, and I always feel like my own life is like this. I doubled the generation on my mother by getting a PhD. That is, the more education a woman has, the later she has her children. She also tends to have a smaller family. She also is better able to engage and has more control over her finances and her household and has more influence in her community. And women have historically invested in their families and communities in ways that are more sustainable than men. And that is the weighting that's going into their calculations there.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
I think we'll come back to this one with a little more of a question of what can be done locally. I'm going to jump a bit to, can you elaborate a bit on what was taken out of Biden's Build Back Better bill that would have helped more?
Yeah, the biggest thing was the clean electricity power plan. The goal there was to enforce a a percent that had to be increased over time of how much power had to be taken from supplied by clean energy sources. So that provides a strong ratchet. And that's something that's enacted in individual states. Our state does this. We've just, and also individual utility districts sometimes will voluntarily or through a county level process go ahead and take on these kinds of standards. So that the biggest impact that that has is that it is really pushing away from new investments, and it really helps with that closing down coal fast. So it's and it in the longer term, it helps by eliminating natural gas, that bridge to the future that may have been an illusion because of the methane impacts.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to ask this question, but then also share a comment that's related. Do you think expansion of nuclear power is part of the solution to climate change? And there was a comment that nuclear power costs about 4 times as much as wind and solar. And additionally, wind and solar, nuclear produces much of that power during times when it's not needed. So meaning that we have to invest in storage to save it for when we need that power. And in the case of wind and solar, it's because there is often no wind or sun. In the case of nuclear, the plants run all night and all weekend, and even when there is little demand. So I guess coming back to the question, what role does nuclear power play in climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. It's I'm a bit obsessed with trying to get action going by 2030, and nuclear is not a good route for that. And the reason for that is it takes it is a political one. It will take a lot to get new nuclear going in this country, and it also has to take longer and is more expensive. So in terms of having more limited resources, that the upfront cost already being an issue, going for more wind and solar now would be more compatible, and the kinds of grid improvements that we would need that go along with that, which I failed to mention before. I'm very also influenced by, we have to worry about the impacts of nuclear waste. And while I'm encouraged by where nuclear power is today, and there are definitely strengths, so I could see it as the right choice in the right situation. But I don't know that it's a general solution that we should be following now. It's included in drawdown, and it's included in a number of analyses of how do we get to 80% renewable, for example, and renewable / and then they'll plus nuclear. So it's definitely very seriously considered, and I do think we will see some limited expansion of nuclear as part of trying to get to a long-term solution, not trying to really get to zero.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
A question about are corporations and the private sector moving more money into responsible climate investments?
Yeah, it's starting to pick up finally. It is, it's now possible to have your entire, retirement portfolio in stuff that's only if it has an investment in clean. There are some major investments that are moving forward. We also get to hear about the Bezos Fund and things like that, where we're seeing really quite large investments. And I think some constructive pressure for them to be much larger investments. And what I find really fascinating about this moment in time that's really different from even 2 years ago is the general acknowledgement and sense that this is actually the strategic move to make. And that those who move fast will get the most wealth out of it, so that there's actually, a much more buzz around making change than I've ever seen. So it's interesting. I'm hopeful.
Good, good. um, how does or should undergraduate college curriculum respond to the needs of the future that you've outlined here in your talk?
That's a topic that we talk about all the time. Um, we have been thinking about this in a whole bunch of different ways. Where I teach, we actually probably emphasize aspects that I didn't in this talk. We have a really strong restoration program. We do a lot of preparation for students to be part of the supporting the land side, the sinks, and supporting mitigation, supporting adaptation. So how do you make your cities greener? How do you make that an equitable move so that everyone has access to a cooler city through more greening, for example? But we do have on the engineering side of our house a lot of interest in we have people who are active solar energy researchers. We have some new work that's going on around ocean energy, tidal especially. And I think that increasingly, that is going to be an emphasis. A lot of the computer science students have started to work as, there's an awful lot to improving, smart grids and being part of that kind of partnership with local organizations that are working on these kinds of issues. How can we get our students involved through internships and the like? For my part in environmental studies, I teach a lot of general education courses, and I am after providing the sense that we actually can do quite a lot here, recognizing just how much happens in this state and how much pressure is put through this state, and therefore how much of our actions actually as Washingtonians are going to make a big impact. I think it helps take away some of that sense of dread and despair to think I can be agentic. I 20-year-old can do something, and that it has an impact.
And that sort of brings it back around to the more local questions that are in the chat. What can we do locally in terms of counties and cities in the South Sound? And we know that we have a couple of people on the call with us who, if you of course, you're welcome to respond first, but more directly to Thurston County, we have Lynn Fitzhugh from the TCAT with us, who may be able to speak to some of the more local initiatives, as well as Jim Lazar. So I invite you first to respond, and then we can certainly see if either of them want to mention any of the more local activities.
I guess I can speak to the big population center of part of the Sound, which is where I am. And so I don't know so well what you should do for Thurston. So I won't speak to that, but rather just say, I'm just so impressed with how many different opportunities there are to get involved. We have worked really hard to provide entries for students to all levels of government, a really large range of tiny community NGOs to really big conservation NGOs and think tanks. And so there's really kind of a lot of opportunity to get involved in all of these areas. And then as an individual, for myself, it makes me really aware. I should probably do that, write that letter every day, make these phone calls, be involved. I'm impressed how many people from our program have ended up in public office. They have realized actually the most direct thing I can do is run and be a county commissioner, is get on the utility board, get on the school board. And so I think taking that active role as a citizen really is empowering and helpful. So really taking it on as something that is part of our regular life. So.
Great. I don't know if the other two folks that I called out want to unmute themselves and say anything about some of the local, more Thurston County and South Sound initiatives? Please don't feel like you have to, but people are interested. I see Jim unmuted himself.
Yeah, I was hoping that Lynn Fitzhugh, who's staff for Thurston Climate Action Team, would jump in here. TCAT is a dozen-year-old local organization that has been involved in climate work here. We have persuaded our county and the 3 cities to complete a climate mitigation plan. We are now working on the implementation of that plan. ThurstonClimateAction.org. We have a buildings team working on improving the efficiency of buildings and reducing the reliance of natural gas in buildings. We have a transportation group working on promotion of electric vehicles, including we've had a number of electric vehicle flash mobs. It's just sort of 20 electric vehicles show up at the mall and start waving signs around, inviting people to come and look at our cars. We have a tree group that's working on protecting and enhancing the unpaid slaves of carbon dioxide absorption, trees. And we're now working with our city councils and our county commissioners on some of the hard legislation, natural gas hookup limitations, mandatory audit of houses at the time of listing for sale, so the buyers will know what energy measures will pay for themselves in 10 years or less. And we need more volunteers, and we need your support. Visit us at ThurstonClimateAction.org.
Excellent, thank you. And Jim, that just I think reiterates what Martha said about that there are truly local opportunities here in the state of Washington to get involved. So thank you for sharing a little about what's going on and how to get involved.
I just want to express some admiration too for the range of creativity and all of those different responses. That's lovely.
So we're down to I think the last question and a comment, but there's a question here about your thoughts on removal of dams in the state of Washington, and how the kind of that balancing act of the salmon interests and the hydropower energy. That's kind of a compounding issue that's directly related in different ways, harming and helping the environment. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's a great one, and it's so much harder than the Elwha Dam removal. For example, those dams had so much less that they were offering. I tend to be in favor. Partly because of it appears from some of the analyses I've seen that replacing that power, at least within our area, is not as difficult. And then that, of course, puts all the power that's sold onto California. I'm not quite sure what that impacts, not having that revenue, and also how well California makes up for that deficit. Those are questions. And so I haven't seen something that shows, an equivalent to replace that energy. But I'm really curious, and I can't say that I'm current on all of it. Definitely the ecologist in me, and there were a lot of treaties signed that we are obligated under, that say we need to be delivering an ecosystem that supports salmon. So I'm very strongly in favor.
I just want to add to that for a minute. I am a retired fish and wildlife biologist from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And although I don't have much experience in the Columbia River, I have just earlier today been party to a discussion on removal of the 4 Snake River dams, which could be done because of so many reasons. They're not providing a lot of energy. They are not providing a lot of transportation compared to what it could be. There's alternate forms of transportation if the farmers want it. And we have to act right away.
Yeah.
People have known about this for the last 70 years,
Right.
because the first paper coming out from the Department of Fisheries is the same year that I was born. So,
Oh my God.
yeah. So the science is complete, and it's just a matter of making sure that all our representatives are, especially here in the Northwest, are amenable to this. And that's where it's at right now. So it certainly got me fired up to write letters. I'm trying, as you do, to write one every day if I possibly can. And I just want to put in that plug for if you're going to look at priority of dams,
Look at the lake.
because of the salmon runs and because of the orca whales that feed off the salmon and aren't going to change their food habits anytime soon. This is very, very important to me, and I think it should be to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's I'm always fascinated by the expertise of our participants and members, and it's fun to hear from you. So thank you. There's just one last comment that I wanted to share from the chat, that the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges is making a major request to the legislature for initiating a climate solutions across the curriculum initiative to build on the Climb Time initiative already funded for K-12 climate science education. So if that's successful, it will fund faculty development at all of the 34 community and technical colleges in the state of Washington. So just wanted to share that that last comment. With that, Martha, we're happy to have you share any last thoughts.
I'm just really excited to see, just now that I've seen some of the chat and heard the different comments and contributions, just how active this group is. And I hope that you continue to kind of inspire one another towards new activities and keep spreading it out. This is very, very exciting.
Yes, great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us and your expertise. And as I mentioned, if anybody does want to watch this again or share it with a friend, it will be available on the Olympia World Affairs website. And just one final reminder, our next program will be the second Thursday of December, December 9th, same time, 7:30 on Zoom. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Kendall on the International Criminal Court, Human Rights Beacon or Threat to Sovereignty. So we have an exciting, very different topic coming up in December. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to having you join future talks, December and beyond. We anticipate continuing on Zoom for the remainder of our program year, so keep joining us here on our program nights. So thank you, everyone.